Hello, this is Joseph. In today's screencast, we're going to be going over attributes and conditional rendering in Riot. So attributes we're going to use to um, add or remove things like a class or a value inside of a checkbox or inside of a div. And then we're going to use conditional rendering to hide and show content inside of a component. So first thing we're going to do is, I guess, visually show you what we're going to have planned. So we're going to have form, and then we're going to have label, and this will have input type equals text with the name and value, and the name will be on this side. We'll say this is name, and then we're going to have a second label with an input saying has, and this will be a checkbox. So now we have the name on this side, or actually let's just switch the position of this here. So now we have, and do one more thing, sorry. We're going to have a BR there, just in case to break stuff up. So we have what would be like a first name, and then the input, what we're going to type into. Then we're going to have a checkbox to say like has, some conditional thing to make something show. So now let's break this up into components and initialize right and the files and everything else that goes with it. So we're going to type in script type equals text JavaScript, and then we're going to do riot dot mount asterisk, and we're going to head and change this to text box field, and this will have the type of riot slash tag, actually .html, and this will be check box field .html. So I'm going to move these into their components, but before I need to do that, I still need to create these files too. So now they're created. I'll go ahead and copy this into text box field. Now obviously these could be actual components or components you can inherit from, so you don't have to sit there and copy and paste the same type of code over and over again. But I'll show that in another video. This is supposed to just be for what we're doing here. So obviously for these types of components, you have to start with the component name. So this would be text box field, and we're just going to throw that into there. In my previous video, I showed how to do this inline inside the same page, so you're not having to create all these extra files and include them. But this is just showing it this way. This way I can get better syntax highlighting and show you guys more obvious interactions between what's JavaScript, what's CSS, and what's just regular HTML. So let's just copy this little template, put that in there. We're going to call this check box field, and we're going to paste this in there. We're going to leave that BR there as well. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to head, is go ahead and just throw this out, and we're going to start to put in those custom components. So text box field, and I'm going to put in name equals first name, which would be the name of the input, and then label would be first name. And we're going to change this to check box field, and this will be has middle name as middle. So now that's there, let's go ahead and see what happens. So we see the same design as prior because we haven't really injected any of the options into these components. So now we're going to go ahead and do that as well. I'll go ahead and make my script tag type equals. Okay, So here I'm just going to have this dot name equals, and you don't always have to do this. You can do like ops dot whatever in these fields here, but I like mapping them to outside of the options. This way I know what's a part of the component and what was passed into the component. So now I'm going to say this or ops dot name for an empty string. So basically, if there's no name supplied through the attributes or through another way that you're passing in these options, then it's just going to be a blank string. And we're going to do the same for label here as well. So we're going to say label, and name will be passed into this. Okay, so now we have that. Now when we refresh, you'll see that the checkbox now has the actual name that we passed it, or the label that we passed it, which was has middle name, and the name of the input that is the checkbox actually has what we passed there. Now we're going to do the same. We're going to do the same for the text box field. So this is going to be label, and this is going to be name. Okay, so now we're going to have first name with the input, and again the input will have the name equals first underscore name as we defined in the actual component. And so I guess the first piece I want to show you is kind of rendering a class name. Like you want to have a class kind of shown when something happens. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the concept of an error to this component. So we're going to do div class equals error, and then hidden will be based off some type of boolean. So this will actually then show the error. And we're just going to have error always equal a string, or assume it'll always equal a string, and pass that in as an option as well. So we're going to say error. Okay. So now we're going to actually define what is this. So we're going to say if error.length, because it's a string, equals 0, then go ahead and hide the div class error display. Because there's no error to show, we don't want to have the div actually render. And to show what this is going to do, basically when you go ahead and inspect this, we're going to see that the div class hidden is there, but is actually creating this extra line. That's because the div is still rendering, and that's because we still need the styling to back it up. So let's go ahead and create a style tag here. Type equals blah, blah, blah. And then we're going to do dot error first, and we're just going to set the color to dark red, and we're going to set the font weight, come on, to bold, and then we're going to do dot hidden display none. Okay, so now if I refresh this, now we'll see that it's actually collapsed, and that's because the div has the hidden class name rendered in. And again, the hidden is mapping to the key of the object that we're throwing into this thing here, which is just conditional rendering. If this statement is true, then hidden will show in this list of classes. And there's certain ways you can put this inside of attributes for elements. Just always be aware that this only supports certain sets of elements. Other times this won't even work. So let's go ahead and actually introduce an error. So we're going to say text field error equals, actually what's this on this text box? No, text field. Error equals please enter something. Oh, come on. So now we actually have our error in dark red that is bold based off our styling that we had put there. And you'll actually see that the hidden class is actually removed because we supplied an error that conditional statement is actually rendering the class or supplying the class into the class list. Okay, so what's next? Now, hiding and showing something in CSS using this approach doesn't need to happen. You can actually use conditional rendering. So we can just get rid of this completely and then just say if, and do the same thing, error.length. Actually, we won't be doing the same thing. We'll be saying, if there is an actual error, go ahead and render it. If not, do that. So we're going to say if there's a string supplied to it by the length of whatever is entered in, then we'll go ahead and do that. So now we're going to go ahead and render it again. And here you see now, we don't need to have hidden or anything else like that. We have just the class of error and what's provided. Now let's go ahead and remove this, because this is important when you're going to switch between hiding and showing and an actual like if statement in Riot. So we're going to go ahead and remove this here. I'm going to save it and refresh. Now, when I inspect this, the div is completely gone. It is not even shown in the DOM as being a div. And so this is the difference between if and show. So if I use show, it's still going to render in the DOM, but it's going to be display none. So again, if completely removes the element, so it's not in the DOM at all, and then show will have it there, but actually inline style it to display none. And you can also do the same with hide. So if we did that, we'd actually need to change the condition, say 0. And we inspect it, and again, it's going to be display none. So you can do if, show, and hide. Show and hide still has the DOM element present, while if will actually remove the DOM element from render. And you can actually have these on top of this field here. So this is what we're going to go ahead and do. First, we're going to actually switch this back to if, and say length is greater than 0, and actually have another if here saying, actually no, we don't need this for the text field. I'm jumping too far ahead here. So for now, the text box, we want to just throw in checked. So we're going to have checked here equals true. We don't really need it. I don't care what's supplied for that. But then I just want to say, okay, well, we're just going to say checked is based off checked. And then we're going to include checked hops checked. So I would expect this to give me the checked attribute like checked equals, or just checked, which would checkbox the checkbox, check the checkbox by default if not, when the page is rendered. But as you notice, it doesn't work, and it's intentional. The way that you get that to work is that Riot actually understands these attributes. It has like 100+ attributes, or lots and lots of attributes it understands. So we can actually say checked equals, and then you can do the conditionals here. So we can say checked. So if I go ahead and refresh this, it is now checked. And this is super important, because when you want safety and security in mind, you don't want to have the ability just to throw anything that was typed into a key object pair to be tossed inside it as an attribute. So this is filtering out certain stuff to be able to make that Boolean operation happen. Another thing I want to talk about that you're probably going to run into that you think is odd is the value. So value in SRC is an example of this, where you're going to see the value not actually render inside the DOM, but it'll still be there as the value of the input. So we're going to give this the default value of Joseph, and for the text box field, we're going to say this is going to be the value, and we'll copy this one more time. So Joseph's showing there. It says Joseph. It's in the input. Now if I inspect this, you're going to see that value equals curly bracket value, or curly brace value. And this is, you may look at this like, this is wrong, it shouldn't be happening, what's going on? Well, let's go ahead and do something here in the console and say document dot query selector, and then we're going to say name equals first underscore name, and we're going to go ahead and get that, and then we want to go ahead and say input to get the actual input of that, and then we're going to say get attribute value. So this is where you're seeing it, and that's because Riot itself is not actually changing the attribute of value. It's changing the value that's actually of the input. And because that's there, it doesn't need to do the double work of setting multiple values from both the attribute and the value of the input. So just keep that in mind. If you're going to probably run into it, you're going to see certain things still have this curly brace in it. And, you know, like in the SRC example where you're trying to have some page render with an image or something like that, and you look at the image href or SRC and it's still not showing just yet. It's because it's setting the actual property of that DOM object versus trying to set the DOM visual part of it. Yeah, that's basically wrapping up what we can do with conditional statements for rendering as far as checkboxes goes, and showing and hiding class names if you want to. There's a lot more to Riot that's what it deals with as far as attributes go, but this is just the most general way that you can approach it and see what it has to offer. It's very simplistic, very easy to get a grasp and a hold of, and start to modify for your own thing. No, I was doing some example of like when this was going to have that if statement to show or hide an entire thing. This works in every context, but this will be for another tutorial when we're going to be learning about how to interact between components and having either an observable or a global object that you can access that's not a global object, but an object that's accessible through all these components.